Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Black Hat. We're super excited to be kicking things off here this morning. We're going to give a little bit of a different presentation than what Philippe and I are used to giving. Typically at conferences, you see us talking about the latest and greatest zero-day that our team has discovered or end-day research, but we thought it would be interesting to give a presentation on things that haven't worked for us over the last 10-plus years and lessons that we've learned as a result of it. The presentation is geared slightly more towards a junior audience, but hopefully if you're experienced, you'll still get something fun out of this in the process. So first off, who are we? Who are the two idiots standing in front of you? My name is Douglas McKee. I'm a principal engineer and the director of vulnerability research for Trellix. I've been in offensive security for 13, 14 years now, kind of hacking all the different things. And this is my friend and co-worker.
Hi, I'm Philippe Laulheret. I'm a senior security researcher at Trellix. I've been there for like 4 years. I hack all the stuff. I prefer like systems, so I look at like IoT devices, embedded systems, ICS, medical devices, and so on. But otherwise, I do like software and enterprise software and so on. Hack all the stuff.
All right, so to get started, in order to understand all the different things we're going to talk about, we kind of got to give you a very short background on the different projects we've worked on that comprise this presentation. So this will be less than 5 minutes, but we're going to give you a real quick run through of all the projects that make up the rest of the presentation. So to get started, the first one on deck here is a patient monitor that we did research on several years ago. So you have the patient monitor itself, and you have the central monitoring station. They talk over a proprietary protocol called the RWAT protocol, and we were able to find vulnerabilities that allowed us to falsify patient information on the patient monitor itself. Next up, a consumer project. This is on the Belkin Wemo Insight plug. These are real basic devices. You can turn these on or off remotely with your phone, and you can see it has multiple circuit boards in it that we deconstructed the device. Here we were able to find a buffer overflow that allowed us to remotely control the device. We don't just do hardware, we do software too. So this project came about around the COVID time period, and it's centered around distance learning. This software is produced by NetOp. It's their Vision Pro application. It allows teachers to monitor what students are doing on their machines, pass files back and forth, remotely control them and such. We found many vulnerabilities in this, which allowed us to take over the student and teacher machine through different mechanisms. This is a Delta building controller. If you don't know what a building controller is, I promise there's many of them in this building right here. They control things like HVAC, lighting, even access control in some scenarios. This is a deconstructed picture as well, and we were able to find a buffer overflow in this that allowed us to remotely over the internet control this device.
And okay, this one is a fun one. It's an infusion pump. You'd find that like in hospitals for like pain medication, anesthesia, chemotherapy, and so on. So he has like Spacecom, which is a communication module, and we were like able to get root on Spacecom, and from there tamper with the settings of the infusion pump to make it deliver drugs way too fast, which can lead to really bad outcomes. If you're like receiving an infusion at that moment. That one was like a Avaya VoIP phone. I had one of those on my desk, unfortunately not the one with the cool stickers. And I was musing, like how secure are those devices? Clearly they made it on the slide, so not as much as that, but that was like a while ago, so everything is fixed. But basically I was able to find, like a third-party software, like in the firmware of that had like a non-vulnerability. And from there, from the network, we could take over the phone and snoop on the microphone and whatnot. And that turned into like a really interesting like hardware hacking project. And the last one of our list is like Azure Sphere. So it was an IoT device from Microsoft, and they were running a private bug bounty program with some of the partners, and it's like a really locked down device. They had like created like a new chip called Pluton, and they were like wanted to kind of like have the stuff like somewhat audited. And in the end, we were like chaining multiple like CVs. We were like able to get like remote code we were like able to get root on the device. And we got like something like 160K in bug bounty. So with all of those, it's most of these like projects, like are hardware based, and you could be wondering like, are we really like the hardware experts? It's not quite. I mean, this is something. So here's the Avaya phone, like the inside, like I rip it open, And when I was looking at it, I was like, okay, so if I can modify this flash chip here, I could re-enable a bunch of debug capabilities. And from there, I could also, probe like that serial console. It's like a UART port. And if I enable the debug ports and stuff, I should have like a console, and that would be really nice for doing vuln research. So the start, you have like nice, like set up your tools. You have Flux, enabled wire to do like tiny soldering, desoldering bread to like clean up. So it's all nice and tidy, but really when you actually do it, that looks like that. So it's really crappy, like
Don't quit your day job, please.
yeah, right. So here you can see like all the wires are ready to break if you just move it a little. So that's why I put like some tape. I probably burned the tape with the soldering iron. It's sort of like sticky from the flux. So it's a mess. But nonetheless, I was still able to reprogram the chip, and it actually succeeded to enable like the debug console I was after. So here you can see it's not because it's like dirty or not good that it still get the jobs done, which is important. And then you had like this like UART, like it's like little pads, and it's nice. It's labeled says UART, so it's a serial console that you could like connect to. So in theory, like the way to go is you have like these things called like pogo pins, which like spring-loaded like spikes, and you create like a rig, you put the board, everything is really calibrated and stuff. But we have none of that, and instead, I went with like this like little cheap like fly wires. And the idea was like one side was connected to my machine, and the other was just like holding it and start like poking at the stuff to see if it works or not. And you can see here like a picture I took was like I was probing a port. That's not an Ethernet port. It looks like it, but it isn't. And on that one, I was looking for like a transmit pin so that I could like send data to the console. And I was holding the thing in one hand, pressing the key on my keyboard at the same time, and looking at the screen to see if it worked. It's really crappy, but it actually did work. And from there, I was able to get like a root shell on the device. So of course, you need like physical access. So that's not like the great breakthrough, but that enabled like vuln research further. And the point here is like we don't need like fancy tools. It's really crappy and stuff, but it still actually works. Yep.
So you would think with the litany of projects that we showed you that were hardware-based, that it would be pretty easy for us to identify like where a flash chip is and where firmware is. And when we were working on the infusion pump project, as Philippe mentioned, we knew that there was this software called SpaceCom. And we had completely deconstructed the device, we had pulled off all the flash chips, and we were like, where the heck is this SpaceCom software? It has to be on here somewhere. Well, I'm rummaging through the components, and I end up picking up the battery of the infusion pump, and I see that there's a MAC address on a sticker on a battery. And I was like, that's odd. Since when do batteries have MAC addresses? And so I very delicately start to take apart this battery to make sure that I can keep it in pristine condition to see if there's anything besides just a battery inside. And we were actually really excited because there was an entire circuit board that had a microcontroller on it, it had an RF module, and it had a flash chip. And we had just got a new BGA rework station in the lab at the time, and super excited to be like, hey, let's toss this in the BGA rework station and pull off the chip. Probably should have read the directions first, but I'll come back to that later. And so we extracted off the BGA chip. Now, we had more experience at the time working with TSOP chips than BGA chips, and once you get the chip off, realized, well, we're going to have to reball this thing in order to get it in a reader. And so we did the natural logical thing and tried to manually reball this chip, and I can see a few snickerings in the room, because if you've ever tried to do this, this is absolutely insane. And I can also show you, point out a few more key failures in this picture, right? So we've got a chip with electrical tape on top of a plastic spindle of wire that we're looking through a microscope that's stacked on 2 dead computers using a soldering iron head that's way too big for this job. So needless to say, this didn't work, right? We had completely fried the chip at the time, and there was no hope in getting software off after everything that we had put it through. Now, obviously, the project ended up being successful, and I'll let Philippe tell you a little bit more about how we overcame this problem here shortly. But the lesson learned that we're trying to give that has nothing to do with these specific projects is that breaking things is part of the hardware hacking process. And you should expect that if you're going to do any type of hardware research. We highly recommend that you don't embark on any of these tasks unless you have multiple versions of the device that you're going to analyze. And also, try to do the least invasive process first. You don't necessarily need to go this length. A lot of times we get excited and we want to jump into the hardware because that's the cool thing to do. But there's so many other approaches we can take, and we'll talk about some of them here shortly.
Yeah, and just clear, like on that one, you should have do the Proby stuff I was talking
Probably,
about. That
yeah.
would have helped. But yeah, so like another important factor, like when you do like research, sometimes it's just being lucky, which it's that's what it is. But one of example, I was going over like our extended documentation on the Slack, and looking at Spacecom, I was googling all the keywords related to that, and at some point I found some guy who was like actually building Spacecom on GitHub, and I was like, what's going on here? So it's probably like some like GPL release type of things. But I started like digging through that in GitHub, and I found that stuff where it says like, oh, in one of the commits you had like www.tar, which is like like an interesting and exciting artifact for like me, because I wanted to get my hand on the web stuff. That's what we're trying to do in the previous slides. So you can see like this time that was not our mistake, that was somebody else's mistake. But over there, like the guys like kind of like messed up and committed like all of the binary artifact of the stuff on GitHub at some point. And I think like a year later, someone was like, yeah, maybe that's not a great idea. But really what happened is like GitHub remembers, and so from that we were like really lucky and able to capitalize on that. The second example of like weird luck that was interesting was the Azure Sphere project. So to give an idea, that board is extremely locked down, and for that we were like doing a bug bounty with Microsoft because we're like partner with them. And the idea is that like this really fancy chip, like super secure element, but to start like probing that, you'd have to get like root access on the device itself, and Microsoft was not giving us that. And the idea is you can unlock features by providing like a capability file. And I was curious, what are the capabilities? And I decompiled the command line tool that lets you like provision the stuff, and I found like all of the capabilities existing. And one of them was like, yeah, you can actually debug the fancy chip. And I think we tried like ask politely like Microsoft if they would like give it to us, like that capability for our board, and they're like, yeah, no, that's not going to happen. And I was like, oh, crap. And so I kept reversing that tool, and I realized it mentioned, like, it was fetching these capabilities from, I don't know, prod.microsoft.azuresphere.com or something. But also, like mentioned there, you had like pre-prod and staging and dev. And so I had a great idea. Maybe if I talk to dev environment instead of prod environment, they will be like give me more capabilities. So I tried, and that did not work. Like you can see on the screenshot, that's the result. I just get exactly the same capability I had before. That was just a failure. But I remember that thing, like in the documentation of Azure Sphere, like you can only claim a device once. So you can only say, this is my device once, and then it's over. And that's how you like able to like get the capability to push code on it. But if we go back to the previous slide, we can see here, like, so it says now you're in the pre-prod environment, but it also asks me to claim the device again on that pre-prod environment. And then everything works just fine. And so, that's not what I was looking for, but I was like, wait a minute, why did it ask me to claim it again? That's weird, that shouldn't happen. That's breaking the security posture here, because, I can claim twice. And yeah, we told Microsoft that, and they were like, yeah, that's a critical bug. Here's like $48,000 for that. So like, that was extremely lucky. So what happened was, I tried something that failed, but by picking, this weird situation where like something was off, I was able to like move on and get something actually interesting. So sometimes you need to capitalize on your luck and be able to handle those like situations.
Another thing that goes hand in hand with getting lucky is assumptions. And a lot of times assumptions can be the death of the way that we do a research project. We assume, oh, the vendor or the developer definitely would have thought of this, and so we're not going to look at this. Or this is going to be too hard, so there's no reason to go in a certain direction. And I'm going to use the NetOp project for this example. And NetOp, again, is a student monitoring software, and it had a huge, wide range of features, right? And so we're going through enumerating these features and investigating what this can do. And one of those features is this remote control feature. And this remote control feature is, for lack of a better term, it's a wrapper around RDP, basically. It allows you to log in using Windows credentials to a student's machine, and you have full access to that. Now, when I say wrapper around RDP, or you're thinking Windows credentials and login, it's really easy to make the assumption that, well, of course they encrypted those credentials. Why would they possibly be in clear text on the wire? And never look for these type of things. And we actually ran into this looking for something completely different in the Wireshark capture and found out that the credentials for the Windows system were not encrypted going over the wire. This is no advanced hacking that Philippe or I did or anyone else in the project. It just happened to be that way. But you have to know to look for these things and not make that assumption. And so that's kind of our takeaway from this section of the presentation is there is a degree of luck, and you have to understand that when you're doing research. But there's also learning from your past experiences and just going through the motions and knowing and looking at all the different components, whether you think it's going to be that way or not. So the next topic we're going to talk about is documentation. I love talking about documentation to researchers because I feel like there's no way that you don't hate it. You either hate reading documentation, or you hate creating documentation, or you hate both. But the funny thing is documentation ends up playing a really key component in a lot of the research projects that we've done. And one of the examples I'm going to use for this, and again, even as researchers have done this more than once, we forget to read the documentation all the time. So the patient monitor project, I had pulled the SAM file off the central monitoring station, and they had different levels of authentication, and that allowed you different access. And of course, my knee-jerk reaction being in red teaming for I don't know how many years was, let me throw this on the GPU cracker, right, and get these passwords so that way I can get into the next level of the system and learn more about it and continue my research. Well, after some time, I wasn't able to produce the passwords using a cracker. And several months later, I finally got around to reading the documentation, which clearly had all the passwords in plain text right in the documentation. Not only so, but found out that they're hard-coded to the point that you're not supposed to even be able to change them. So if I would have simply taken the time to read the docs before doing this, I would have progressed my project a lot further ahead of time. Another thing I think we forget as researchers is that code is documentation. And we can get into an argument about whether or not we always have the source code because of reverse engineering and ASM. But for the moment, let's talk about just open source code. And most of our projects, there are some component that contain third-party components that are open source, and therefore you have code to read. Well, during the Wemo project, the vulnerability was discovered very quickly. It was very easy to leverage. It was through sending an XML packet to the device. Jumped right into exploitation, didn't even think anything further of it. And I struggled during exploitation in the beginning, which it was a classic buffer overflow, should not have been any struggle at all. And realized that my characters weren't getting through, or especially my shellcode was not getting through to the stack. Well, if I would have taken the time to read the XML library, it's very clear in here that the XML code filters out quite a bit of characters. And this is something we encounter in exploitation all the time. And it's extremely limited character set that's allowed through the XML filter. It's just another example of where I could have saved an immense amount of time if I would have taken the time to read through what's going on in the code that I'm actually working with. So what's our takeaway from this? The good old classic RTFM still applies, and this also counts for open source resources too. Don't get so narrow into just the manual, but as Philippe has demonstrated, finding resources on GitHub. The old adage still stands true.
Yeah, and I also think finding GPL stuff can be extremely powerful, like in all situations like that. So that's another good one to remember. Anyway. One of the things is, when you do vuln research, it's not always, smooth sailing. Sometimes there are actually trouble that can happen. One of them was in the space, in the infusion pump project we were working on. So I said we got root on Spacecom, but before that we only had, a limited user RC, and we wanted to escalate our privilege. So by reading the code and stuff, we eventually found that where they cd to the root directory, and they extract a tar file, and root is doing that, and this tar file is just a backup of the configuration. And so you could back up the configuration, plant a SUID binary in it, and push it back, and from there you have a privilege escalation. So that's nice to have root exploit and stuff, and we're okay, we're perfectly in a great position to the next step of the project, which is targeting the infusion pump itself. But because life happened, Doug and I had to put this project on hold. And I don't know, a few months later, we are finally ready to resume that stuff. And as I said, I love to Google all the stuff, and eventually I found that stuff, which is a white paper that was published like 2 months prior, where like some German agency commissioned like a state-of-the-art of medical IOMT devices, medical devices, and the research team like looked at exactly the same device we had looked at and disclosed all of the bugs we had found. So Doug and I were like really sad about it. And that was really like one of the lowest parts of the project. But we didn't give up, and eventually we like persisted because these guys who like released that stuff stopped at Spacecom, and so we moved on and targeted the pump, and eventually we would find some really fun stuff. But that happens, and there's like reason for that. If we had like submitted too soon, and that might have tipped our hands and forced the project to stop like sooner. So there were like reasons, but it's going to happen. Bug collision happens, and that's the way of life.
Another thing that we deal with on a regular basis is I like to joke that I spend 70 to 75% of my time just building out a system or learning about a system, and only 20 to 25% of my time actually doing any hacking. And I think that's something that's very common that we don't often talk about, is that there's a lot of work that goes into setting up for our testing and doing just our research. And there's a lot of struggles in that. And one of those struggles has to do with cross-compiling. And I put on the screen here a screenshot of a coworker of mine, Mark Bereza, who wrote this in our document on our Confluence and documentation in a joking manner, but it's true, right? So he talks about here that we found an embedded device that was perfectly preserved in metaphorical cyber amber. And what do? Do you donate it to a museum, or do you try to hack it? And of course, we try to hack it. And this requires a lot of legwork to be able to cross-compile tools. We actually had to go back all the way to Ubuntu 12 in order to build out a system. This is for the Delta controller project, to build out a system that we could build tools to put on that project. And we struggled with this for weeks, and eventually found that there was one small flag that needed to be set in the build root system through going through messaging boards. And it says here the extended local support, and that one flag was the difference between our libc versions matching or not matching on the device. And I also like to talk about how most of the time we're looking for to get GDB server or those type of tools on the device to do research. And there's 100 different GDB server versions already pre-compiled on GitHub, and I swear none of them ever work for any project that I need, and I have to start from scratch. But the point here is that not to show you one specific flag that you need to turn on for your compiler, because that's going to be different for every single project that you do, but is to kind of highlight that we all go through these struggles. And these are struggles that aren't commonly talked about in DEF CON Black Hat presentations where someone's telling you about how they went from, oh, I decided to do this research project and here's what I finished at the end. But there are things that we all work on and we have to fight through, and they're common. And along that, a lot of this industry suffers from imposter syndrome, right? Thinking we're not good enough or perfectionist, working really hard to get something to what we think is done, and the adage that perfection can be the enemy of done. So I'll show you a few examples of imperfected pieces of code that have actually worked well for us during projects, and that you can still be successful. So this is talking about the Delta building controller project. And we ran into a watchdog, a software watchdog. If you haven't done much embedded research before, a watchdog is simply either a piece of hardware or software which checks if the system has been stalled in any way, shape, or form, or if an action hasn't occurred in a certain time period, and then it takes an action as a result. Typically, that action is to reboot the system. You find these all the time in critical systems or real-time systems. And so we were doing some static code analysis, and we ran into a software watchdog, and we thought we were all super elite, and we opened up IDA, and we patched it real quick and spit out a new binary and then put that on the device, just to find out that that didn't fix our problem at all, because there was actually a hardware watchdog that was causing us a problem. And so we had to figure out, how are we going to disable this hardware watchdog? And I decided to write a very small piece of C code that would proverbially kick the dog. And I just called an external function from a DLL that was already on the system in this really sophisticated piece of C code. This is literally the entire program except for the int main. And it's an infinite while loop calling one function every millisecond to make sure that the make sure that we didn't trip the watchdog. And I even went through the awesome C style here of hard coding how many characters are in my error messages, right? I'm pretty sure my C professor is cringing if he's watching this right now, because this is not the best way to write C code. But it works, right? And it solved the problem we had, and we're able to move on from it. Another aspect in this is I like to talk about fuzzing. Fuzzing sometimes for our industry can be like this huge mountain or hurdle that we're afraid to tackle or work with because we just feel like we don't know enough about it. And don't get me wrong, fuzzing can be extremely complicated. There's lots of techniques out there and different methods and different tools, but it doesn't have to be. And here's some example of some, I'm going to use air quotes, fuzzing that I did on the patient monitor project that actually produced useful results. And my point with this is don't let complex topics deter you from trying techniques during your research, and don't let that be a hurdle. Make it super simple, give that a go, and then grow from there and learn further about it. So what's our takeaway from this section is that your solution might not be elegant, but if it works, who cares, right? At the end of the day, if you're trying to accomplish a goal for research, let that be your mantra. Sure, if you're going to release a tool publicly or you're going to work on production code, you want things to be polished. But a lot of times in research on the back end, that's not what we need to do. All right, so the last topic, or one of the last topics we want to talk about is rejection and resilience in general. So we're going to talk about this in two aspects, and the first is from a vendor disclosure perspective. So at Trellix, we practice responsible disclosure because our ultimate goal is to hopefully produce more secure products in the industry, and so we disclose to vendors, and then of course publicly after we disclose to vendors, hoping that there's a patch available. And we really do this with the best intentions in mind, right? We're not trying to drop 0 days and make vendors look bad or anything like that. We truly want to make things more secure. But not everybody sees it that way. And for a disclaimer, these snippets are not related to projects in this deck, so you cannot try to correlate who said this from these projects. They're from projects we're not talking about today. But we still have disdain in the industry when someone tries to go through responsible disclosures. And these are just some examples. Like we've been threatened with legal action. We've had conference presentations be threatened to be taken down or wanted to be scrubbed. We've had vendors not communicate with us at all, which makes responsible disclosure hard and decisions to make. And I will say in the last, 5 to 10 years, I think this has gotten a lot better, and I would say 90% of our disclosures go very, very smoothly, and vendors do a great job working with us. But this does still exist, and if this happens to you, you shouldn't take it personally, and you shouldn't think it's something that you're doing wrong. This is something we have to work better at as an entire industry, smoothing out in the process. So my question, Philippe, to you is, have you ever got rejected from a conference before?
Yeah, all the time. Unfortunately, that happens. So yeah, if you look at, there's like some screenshot of some of the rejection Doug and I both got. So I think the first two, it's, we submitted like a talk to big conferences, like, nah, that's not for us. But really like what happened was like the same talk got accepted in like multiple conferences, worldwide and stuff. So sometimes you can be like thinking, well, maybe, do you really match the CFP and whatnot? But also sometimes something that helps is like, well, it's a hurt for the ego, but it's better just to say like their loss than like, like going into like existential crisis. And the next two at the bottom, Doug and I submitted to a conference and a few months ago, and I had submitted a second talk just to be really sure, like at least one accepted. And what we knew was like both was like shortlisted among the last one, so like maybe not, who knows. And eventually we got like a first refusal for the first one, but they were like really specific that each talk that was still pending would receive like either like an approval or a denial. And for like the following like 3 weeks, I think I was really hoping, waiting, keep refreshing the email, the website, like trying to see, like crossing my fingers, am I getting accepted? And after a good like 3 weeks, I messaged them, like, hey, you're like a month late, like what's going on? And like, dude, we already rejected your talk like 3 weeks ago. Why did you? And so I think what happened was they just wire got crossed and they just forget about it. So. And I think in that point, what I'm trying to say, sometimes, like you can build your expectation, and that's unfortunate. So it's good sometimes to be a little more assertive also, and, ping the CFP board, not respectfully, but not build too much expectation. And because I never learned from my own mistakes, the submitted button on the bottom right is like another conference I submitted to. And I think the conference happened like a month or two ago, and I'm still waiting to hear if I'm presenting or not. So sometimes you can get also ghosted by conferences or just forget, and so it's good to ping them. Okay, so on the other hand, to try to optimize your chance to get accepted, framing is important. So the Avaya phone that I was talking about, it was a vulnerability in third-party component that was already known. The thing people didn't know was that that vulnerable component was in the firmware of the device. So by all means, that's not like a sexy vulnerability. I didn't even find the bug itself. I just found it was there. But those phones are everywhere. Like when you know to recognize them, you see they're really all the places, even at the conference hotel we were at. But anyway, the point is, I was why? If a bug has been there for 10 years, why nobody noticed? And my assumption was well, hardware hacking is a different set of skills, and that's a little scary when you've never done it. But you've seen in my previous slides, you can do shit work, but it still get the job done, so it's fine. And so I was well, maybe I could help people overcome this discomfort and turn that project into an introduction to hardware hacking to show how it's done, because that was not hard and everyone can do it. And so I submitted that, and it actually got accepted. So I was able to turn that crappy vulnerability into a really useful tool to share with people. So framing is important. And understanding the expectation of the CFP review board, the attendees, and so on, so that you tailor what you submit to the conferences you want to go to. So yeah, I think the lesson here is you have to reject rejection or accept rejection. I don't know. The point is, it's part of the process. I know friends of mine was scared of submitting to a talk because he was to a conference because he wasn't sure if it was good enough. Or you should just submit. If you have something that you find is interesting, other people will likely find it interesting, and you should just try. Worst case, yeah, you're going to get a rejection letter, but who cares, And best case scenario, you actually get accepted, and that's great. So it's important not to, cut yourself short and just not try. So I would really like to say that to people, embrace it and just frame it and understand how things works, but go for it. And now, just to wrap up, what all the stuff we have, a couple of life advice that I guess I wish someone told me at some point. The first one, one is really important, is watch out for burnout. I think one of the mantra to people repeat all the time is try harder. And for sure, persistence is important. But sometimes it's not great. You can, bang your head on a problem, and eventually something is going to crack, either the problem or your head, and that's not necessarily great. So in the case with the infusion pump, originally Doug reached out to me because he had dumped the firmware of the thing, and he was oh, do you think there is flash on that stuff? And I'm sure Doug would have been able to figure it out on his own, but that's one of my forte to find that kind of stuff. And because he reached out, instead of just trying harder to figure it out on his own, we both worked on that wonderful project, had great result, and so on. So try harder, maybe sometimes, but also reach out and understand you have teammates and whatnot. So not always try harder, but try smarter maybe. The other one is, this overused comic, this is fine. Well, sometimes it's not, this poor dog is surrounded by fire. I've been in that situation, not in this current job, but in the past. And I think it's easy, in our industry, to think that, we go from one fire to the next and the next. And sometimes it's warranted, if you're doing, incident response and there's really a fire right now, that's one thing. But sometimes it might be mismanagement or weird expectation. And just people abusing the fact that we all love what we do and we're really intense in our work. And so everything becomes critical because, management said that. So, don't be this dog. Don't assume this is fine. At least acknowledge it. Sometimes that cannot be helped. Sometimes it can. So try to be a little smart about that and protect yourself. And the last one, I wanted to put some cool art. But the idea is don't be Icarus. If you fly too close to the sun, you you burn your wings and you fall. For me, that was like the Azure Sphere project. So, there was like a 3 months really intense challenge. That's really fun. I was really excited. There's like a lot of like cool stuff to work on. It was really hard and exciting. And yeah, I worked, like 200% on that. I was like full on because it was fun. Nobody forced me. But when I was done, I felt really empty. So, it was like the cool stuff was over, and it took me, I think, months to recover from it, just to like, get excited about something again. And so that's the thing I want to say here is like, it's good to pace yourself, The fun stuff you're working on Friday will still be there on Monday, so, you don't have to work the whole weekend on it. Sure, you can do it if you want, but, at some point, like a candle that burns really bright, like will like burn short or something. Not the right idea, but you get what I'm saying. It's like it's easy to get burnout on stuff, and we should be like mindful of that and protect ourselves. And I think one trick to help preventing that is to keep it fun. So we're lucky, like in our industry, like we have a lot of fun stuff we can work on. Like CTF, going to conferences, meeting our peers and whatnot. And that example I picked is just like an old project of mine where I was like, I'm going to reverse Final Fantasy VII and extract some text in Japanese and live translate it so I can learn Japanese. That one was also kind of a mess success because it worked, but I never learned Japanese through that. I did learn some MIPS, so that was useful. But the point is, it's fun. There is no point in that. It's just like, I'm not going to find a CVE. It's not, you cannot monetize it. But it's fun. And I think if you ask me, like many other projects that couldn't fit on these slides, like from other people who also work on really fun stuff. And I think it's important for everyone in this room to figure out, like, why are you in security? Why is it fun for you? And use that to nurture your excitement, and don't get sucked dry from like all the crazy fire around you, and remember to enjoy it while you can. So I think now it's time to wrap up. We've covered like tons of projects, and I think by all means they are all really like successful. Like bounties, tons of CVs, conference talks, and so on. But we're like not here to brag about it. The point we really want to make is, at all the conferences you go to, like people share like the shiny results, all the cool stuff, at conferences or on YouTube or wherever, like the bug bounty people, they all share their success. And if you're like new in the industry, or if you like, try to get into vuln research, you might compare yourself to those, like the shiny results, and you will never match that because, you struggle, it's difficult, there is rejection and whatnot. But the truth is, like what we see on stage is just like a tiny sliver of like reality. And that should not stop anyone from trying and having fun and submitting to conferences and just following like what's exciting. So I think that's the important stuff we wanted to share here. And yeah, I think we have like 3 minutes for questions. And otherwise, you can find us on social media, and we'll have a follow-up discussion tomorrow. So yeah, we have like 3 minutes for questions.
Attendees are welcome to come to the microphone to ask their questions.
Yeah, and thank you guys.